Hello, and so here I am with yet another video on British politics and perhaps the mess that we appear to be in politically. It seems that no sooner as I record one video, whether that's on the changing of the monarch to what's happening with regard to prime ministers, that I've got to record another video because the old one is out of date. Anyway, so here's the latest video. Basically recorded on the day that Rishi Sunak becomes the third Conservative Prime Minister in as many months. Okay, well, I think the first and most obvious thing to say is that if you arrived in the UK from another planet, you may be forgiven for thinking that we change Prime Minister every few months. This is really a rather unprecedented time that we live in. So this video is going to look at what a Prime Minister actually does, why we've had three in quick succession, why does it matter, and lastly, is it actually democratic? So the first thing to say is that the Prime Minister is the leader of His Majesty's government. They're basically responsible for the policies and decisions that the government makes. They happen to be the leader of the political party that has the most MPs in Parliament. Now, if you're not familiar with that, we currently have 650 members of Parliament. And the current Conservative government has 357 of those MPs. Labour is the second biggest party with 196 MPs, and there are also MPs from other smaller political parties: Scottish National Party, Plaid Cymru, the Green Party, Liberal Democrats, etc. So with 650 MPs sitting in the House of Commons and 357 of those being Conservative, it means that the Conservatives have a working majority of 71. Why is that important? Well, it basically means that if every single one of those Conservative MPs supports a government policy, then that government policy will go through the House of Commons without any problem whatsoever. So let's deal with Boris Johnson first of all. You're all familiar with Boris Johnson, no doubt, and as the leader of the Conservative Party during the 2019 general election, Boris Johnson became Prime Minister. Now, 3 years after he was elected, things started to go wrong. There was, as you know, controversy over parties at Downing Street during the COVID lockdown, famously encapsulated by a picture of the Queen mourning the death of her husband alone at St George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, whilst the night before there was a get-together at Downing Street. There were also questions over Boris Johnson's judgment. He appeared to have not been capable of advising government ministers when things were going wrong. They were forced to appear on TV and they were rather embarrassed by what then came out. As a result of that, he had to resign after he lost the support of 50 senior politicians. Now, that led to the appointment of Liz Truss. So Liz Truss, what can we say about her? Well, she's the shortest serving Prime Minister in history. She managed to last 45 days in the job. The next shortest was George Canning, but at least he had the excuse of dying in office. So Liz Truss became Prime Minister after a leadership contest. Basically, MPs voted for a short list of candidates after Boris Johnson's resignation, and when this was complete, Conservative Party members voted for Liz Truss over Rishi Sunak. Now, there's about 150,000 Conservative Party members. They're basically members of a club called the Conservative Party. They pay a little bit of money every year to be in that club, and they get the right to choose the leader. So basically, she was voted leader, and as the leader of the Conservative Party, she was able to become Prime Minister. Now, the question is, where did it all go wrong? And this is a little bit confusing, but hopefully I can explain it in a reasonably simple way. As the leader of the government, Liz Truss is in charge of policies. I previously mentioned that she's the leader of the government. She's in charge of the policies of that government. Now, she had a Chancellor of the Exchequer, a guy called Kwasi Kwarteng, who held, as Chancellor, one of the most senior positions in government. Basically, they are responsible for how the government spends the money it raises through taxation. Now, when she became leader, she had a few promises that she was going to make. It was called Trussonomics, and it didn't go too well. Now, the background to this is that the UK economy is worth $2.7 trillion, because we tend to measure the economies of countries in dollars and not pounds. It's the sixth largest economy in the world. Some people say it's the fifth. Seems to be between India and Britain at the moment. But the government is responsible for public spending. Now, that's a phenomenal amount of money. It's £1,087 billion per year this last year, and that's approximately £38,000 per household. So what happened? Well, unfortunately for Liz Truss, her plan was to cut the amount of tax people paid, that's income tax, and also that companies paid, that's corporation tax. But she didn't actually say how it was going to be paid for. Now, that spooked the financial markets. What does that mean? Well, in other words, banks didn't want to invest money in the UK. They were a bit suspicious of what she was trying to do. That made the pound weaker against the dollar. It also made government borrowing more expensive. Okay, so you're probably sitting here saying, so what? Well, that's passed on to ordinary people. An example of this is mortgage rates. If you want to buy a house, you need to get a mortgage. So let's say you borrow £150,000 and you borrowed that money in November 2021. Well, at that time, you would have needed to pay back £571 a month for 25 years. If you do the calculation, you'll work out that that's a lot more than £150,000, and that's because obviously the bank wants to be paid for lending you the money. Now, if you borrowed the same amount in September 2022, less than a year later, it would cost you £731 a month, or an extra £48,000. That's a huge amount of money. So for ordinary people, the decisions that government makes financially have huge consequences. And that can lead, for example, to a recession, which the country might be in at the moment, which ultimately means that people start to lose their jobs and prices have increased, etc. And you probably are all aware of that. So, the inevitable happened. The economy was in freefall. Liz Truss started to lose credibility with her MPs, and they started to talk behind her back. Now, she had a quick conversation with a guy called Sir Graham Brady. He's chairman of the 1922 committee. Basically, it's a committee in Parliament that represents backbench Conservative MPs. Backbench MPs are the ones who sit on the backbenches who don't have a government job. Basically, Graham Brady told her that it was clear that she had lost their support and would have to resign, which she did. So eager to appoint a successor, potential candidates were told that they needed to get the support of over 100 Conservative MPs. Now, the reason for that was that they wanted the whole process to be quick and finished within a week. Rishi Sunak basically achieved this, and other candidates, which included potentially Boris Johnson, basically withdrew from the process, and Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister. Again, I think we ought to talk a little bit about Rishi Sunak because he's the first British Asian Prime Minister, something that would have been seen as impossible only a few years ago. His parents were also immigrants to the UK. His dad's a doctor, or was a doctor, and his mum owned a chemist shop. I thought she was a pharmacist. He did go to private school, Winchester College, and then he went to Oxford. So he had a very good and very expensive education. He also happens to be married to the daughter of a software billionaire, and the couple are estimated to be worth £700 million. So some people have accused Rishi Sunak of not necessarily being in touch with most of the general public. He appeared on a building site earlier in the year in Prada shoes costing £500, for example. So the last point that we might want to consider is this whole process democratic? Well, the answer's not straightforward. It's kind of yes and no. Although many people would have liked a general election, you don't directly vote for a prime minister. Unless you live in Richmond in Yorkshire, you won't, for example, find Sunak's name on any ballot paper. He's the prime minister because he's the leader of the Conservative Party. Now, he would argue, perhaps quite rightly, that you vote for the person you want to represent in your constituency and not for the Prime Minister. But on the other hand, many people vote because they want a certain political party to win, or because they like the leader of that party. So although they might see another name on their ballot paper, they might just look at the name and think they're Conservative, that's Boris Johnson, I'm voting for them. So many people would argue that in 2019 they voted for Boris Johnson, and in fact that was something that Boris Johnson claimed himself. Can they do anything? Well, the answer's no. The Conservative government have a parliamentary majority, and whilst this remains the case, they can't be removed. So, for at least for the next, 45 days, or perhaps for 2 years until the general election, Rishi Sunak will be our Prime Minister.